Okay, so this will be a quick explanation of why not every function has an inverse function, and how we can restrict the domain of a function to make it have an inverse function. Now here's a function. It's a very simple one, y equals x squared. It's got the graph, which is a parabola. And as you can see, it's a function because for every value of x, there is exactly one value of y. If x is 0, y is 0. If x is probably 1's about here, y is 1. There's a correspondence between every value of x and a value of y. But if we were to take if we were to solve for x, here's what would happen. Y equals x squared. Take the square root of both sides, but remember that every number has two square roots, and a number can have a positive square root or a negative square root. So here we have a positive or negative square root of y equals x. And then if we switch the variables x and y, we get y equals positive or negative square root of x. So that's equivalent to x equals y squared. So all we did there was just switch the variables x and y, and here is what our graph will look like. Now this is not a function because we can see that there are, for every value of x, there is not just one value of y. For if x is right here, y could be either down here or up here because y could be positive or negative. So these are just two ways of writing the exact same equation, and it's not a function. So what can we do to make this function this function have an inverse? Well, right now we have the function y equals x squared. What we can do to make it have an inverse is to delete this whole side of the graph. Now, how can we delete this whole side of the graph? Well, we restrict the domain of x. So we say y equals x squared, x is greater than or equal to 0. We just restricted the domain there. So that means that all of the values where x is less than 0, we're not considering those. It's not part of our function. So then our graph looks like this. Okay, so here's our function y equals x squared, where x is greater than or equal to 0. We can see that the whole left side of this parabola has just disappeared, as we expected. Now, if we were to find the inverse of this function, we'll switch the variables x and y, so we get x equals y squared, where y is greater than or equal to 0. Now, if we solve for y, take the square root of both sides, and like we just said, every number has a positive and a negative square root. So y equals the positive or negative square root of x. But since we've already restricted the domain so that y is greater than or equal to 0, that takes away the negative value of the square root. Y can't be a negative number because we've already established that y is greater than or equal to 0. So now we just have y equals the positive square root of x. And the graph of that is going to look like this. We restricted the domain of a function so that it would have an inverse function, and this is the inverse function.